Lloyd George saw this tremendous capacity that Winston had for looking ahead. So often, the image of Churchill we have is of the great rock-like defender of our liberty in 1940, which is true, and it's his greatness. But as a young man, he was ambitious. He was spontaneous. I mean, he was full of energy. He was full of ideas, and the Liberal Party represented the new ideas.
By 1908, the Liberals were in power. With Lloyd George, Churchill set about radical reform. He had heard about the lives of the poor from his nanny, Mrs. Everest. Now he set up labour exchanges and established the minimum wage. In so doing, Churchill helped lay the foundations of the welfare state. In the spring, he fell in love with a Liberal, Clementine Hosier, a clever and independent woman from an aristocratic but relatively impoverished background. As soon as Parliament had adjourned, he invited her to Blenheim. On a walk in the palace gardens, Winston and Clementine were caught in a sudden downpour and took refuge in the Temple of Diana. Clementine sat in silence.
My mother thought, I don't know, perhaps is he going to propose, isn't he going to propose? And her eye glanced to the floor, and there was a large black beetle advancing slowly across it. And my mother thought to herself, if the beetle reaches that big crack in the floor and he hasn't proposed, I don't think he ever will. And just at that moment, Papa popped the question.
Clementine accepted, but made Churchill promise not to tell anyone about their engagement until she had told her mother.
They started walking back towards the house, and I think the house party was assembled on the lawn. And my father completely lost his head, broke his promise, and ran across the lawn, shouting that they were engaged.
In his memoirs, Churchill wrote, "I was married and lived happily ever after." So far, he had achieved everything that fate had promised. Aged 33, he was a Liberal cabinet minister and, in his own eyes, the youngest man in the country who really counted. In 1910, Winston Churchill was promoted to Home Secretary. But suffragette unrest soon revealed the limits of his liberalism and provoked an instinctively conservative reaction.
The redoubtable Mrs. Pankhurst, aided by her daughters Christabel and Sylvia, determined upon violent courses.
Churchill hated the suffragettes' violence. In November, when they demonstrated in Westminster, he was accused of being responsible for police brutality against them.
My mother felt revulsion for his militaristic, chauvinistic, aggressive attitude. I think she saw him as an ambitious politician, not as somebody who was motivated by deep convictions, and felt that he lacked a general humanitarian, a broad humanitarian vision.
Churchill was even more uncompromising when 2 months later the police besieged a house in Sydney Street in East London. He sent in the troops and couldn't resist being close to the action himself. Liberal doubts about his conservative tendencies grew. One member said, "Don't forget that the aristocrat is still there, submerged, but latent." What he needed was a role that would satisfy his yearning for conflict. In October 1911, he was given it. First Lord of the Admiralty.
The maintenance of naval supremacy is our whole foundation. Upon it stands not the empire only. Upon our naval supremacy stands our lives, and the freedom we have guarded for nearly 1,000 years.
War with Germany threatened. Churchill set about modernizing the fleet. He foresaw the importance of war in the air and established the Royal Naval Air Service. As founder, he considered it necessary to become a pilot himself. Churchill once dismissed naval tradition as merely rum, sodomy, and the lash. Now, as First Lord, he revelled in the pomp and ceremony. Many of his admirals deplored his Napoleon-like behavior. Churchill called this his golden age. When the First World War began in August 1914, Churchill and his fleet were ready for battle.
Everything tends towards catastrophe and collapse. I am interested, geared up, and happy. Is it not horrible to be built like that? The preparations have a hideous fascination for me. Everything is ready as it has never been before. I feel sure that we shall give them a good drubbing.
But the First World War quickly became a bloody stalemate in the trenches of France. To break the deadlock, Churchill proposed to outflank Germany. He pushed for a daring naval attack on Germany's ally Turkey through the Dardanelles Straits to Constantinople. He told Lloyd George, "If I can force the Dardanelles by the British Navy, I shall be the greatest man in Europe." But his First Sea Lord, Admiral Fisher, had grave misgivings about the plan.
Dear Winston, you are just simply eaten up with the Dardanelles and can't think of anything else. Damn the Dardanelles. They'll be our grave.
Fisher was right. The Navy suffered severe losses. The Army was sent in to try to save the operation. The result was the terrible slaughter of Gallipoli. Over 42,000 Allied troops were killed.
Lloyd George saw this tremendous capacity that Winston had for seeing the strategic advantage of Gallipoli. But he recognized that Churchill sometimes got it badly wrong. He sometimes lacked judgment. He had vision, but the judgment was something else.
Impulsive and obstinate, Churchill was blamed for the failed assault on the Dardanelles. he was removed from the Admiralty.
He was distraught by the failure of an expedition he'd believed in and which he always thought could have succeeded. My mother said, I thought he would die of grief. It was by far, in her view, by far the worst thing that ever happened to him in politics. It was the lowest moment. And quite a lot of people thought my father was finished, and quite a lot of them hoped he was.
I had long hours of utterly unwanted leisure in which to contemplate the frightful unfolding of the war. At a moment when every fibre of my being was inflamed to action, I was forced to remain a spectator of the tragedy.
As an old soldier, Churchill wanted to fight. He resigned from the government and headed for the trenches of Flanders. Churchill arrived at the front fully equipped with brandy, cigars, and a tin bath with its own copper boiler. He was put in command of the 6th Battalion Royal Scots Fusiliers. His adjutant, Captain Dewar Gibb, recalled his arrival.
When the news spread, a mutinous spirit grew. So he began a conquest over men not easily moved and won over.
I recall Father saying how Churchill coaxed and persuaded people to do his bidding without resentment. I think it was partly his politician's background which made him know that, you might say, every man was a vote. And if that vote was for him, then he was going to succeed.
By 1916, most British troops were living in dreadful squalor. Churchill quickly engaged his war-weary men with his enthusiastic and detailed lessons on the art of trench building. Health and cleanliness came next. Churchill declared his own war on lice. He raised morale and won the hearts of his men.
Winston improved us greatly, and in the meantime, he improved on us. In wet